The iron is cold. It is heavy, it is jagged, and it smells faintly of damp earth and ancient rust. In the mid-afternoon sun of a medieval marketplace, this object does not sit in a pocket. It does not hide beneath a heavy cloak. Instead, it rests quite physically on a man's shoulder. This is 2 feet of hand-forged authority. It is a blunt instrument of metal that serves no purpose in combat, yet it commands more respect than a sharpened sword. To the peasants passing by, the sight of this 5-pound burden is not a display of labor. It is a display of trust. It is a display of access. It is a display of absolute power. Today, the tools we use to secure our world are designed to vanish. We prize the sleek, we prize the thin, and we prize the invisible. But for centuries, hiding your keys was a sign of weakness. To be truly powerful was to let the world see exactly how much you had to lock away. The story usually begins in the dust. 4,000 years ago, in the heat of Mesopotamia and the empire of the pharaohs, the first locks were giants of wood. They were clunky, primitive, and massive things, heavy beams held in place by wooden pins that dropped into deep carved slots. To open them, one needed a key that looked more like an oversized toothbrush or a gnarled branch. It was a mechanical triumph, certainly, but it was loud. It was inefficient. It was cumbersome. It was a tool of pure necessity, meant to guard the grain of the harvest, the gold of the gods, and the secrets of the tomb. But as these wooden bolts transitioned into the bronze and iron of the Roman Empire, the key began to shed its identity as a mere tool. It became a symbol. It became a piece of jewelry. It became a social weapon. In the high society villas of Rome, the key moved from the door to the body. Wealthy senators and merchants did not want their security tucked away in a dusty drawer. They wanted it on their fingers. They commissioned ring keys, functional bronze or gold rings with tiny, intricately carved bits protruding directly from the band. When a man walked into a public bath or a lavish feast, he wore his status for all to see. It was a silent, lethal flex. It communicated a singular message to everyone in the room: I have a chest at home filled with fine silk, rare spices, and minted silver. And I am the only person on earth who holds the code to see it. This was the first version of a verified identity. It wasn't about the convenience of not losing a piece of metal, it was about the theater of ownership. As the Roman light faded and the Middle Ages descended, the theater only grew more elaborate. In the stone corridors of Europe's great castles, a new figure emerged, the keeper of the keys. In the royal courts, titles like Chamberlain or Lord of the Bedchamber were not just domestic roles. They were positions of terrifying influence. These men carried the keys to the kingdom, literally. They held the metal that opened the treasury, the metal that opened the armory, and the metal that opened the king's private chambers. They were the gatekeepers of the royal personhood. They decided who spoke to the monarch. They decided who was granted a favor. They decided who was left to rot in the hallway. The keys they carried were massive. They were often displayed on heavy leather belts or thick, clinking iron chains. The sound of a chamberlain's keys echoing down a stone hallway was a sound of absolute sovereignty. It was a signal to lower one's head. It was a warning to move aside. It was a command to remain silent. To carry the king's keys was to carry a piece of his very soul. The physical weight of that metal on the hip was a constant, bruising reminder of one's proximity to power. If the king took those keys away, he wasn't just firing a servant. He was erasing a man's identity. He was turning a person of trust back into a nameless face in the crowd. But a shift was coming. The world was growing crowded. By the 1700s, the cities of Europe were swelling with a new class of people: the merchants, the lawyers, the craftsmen. Wealth was no longer restricted to the palace. It was flowing into the parlors of the middle class. Everyone had a ledger to hide. Everyone had a family heirloom to guard. Everyone had a reputation to protect. And suddenly the flex of the public key became a catastrophic risk. The pace of the world tightened. As locks became common, the art of breaking them became a professional pursuit. For centuries, the key had been a public badge, but now that visibility was a liability. If a thief in a crowded tavern could see the shape of the key hanging from a merchant's belt, he could memorize the pattern of the wards, those internal obstructions of the lock. With a steady hand, a bit of memory, and a simple file, he could recreate that key in an hour. The very object that shouted a man's status was now the thing that made him a victim. A quiet panic began to set in. Humans have a deep, psychological need to show off their success. But we have a far deeper, primal need to feel safe. The public key began its long, slow retreat. It started to shrink. It moved from the shoulder to the belt. Eventually, it slipped inside the pocket. It became private. It became a secret. It became personal. This was more than a change in fashion. This was a fundamental redesign of human existence. Before this moment, life was largely communal. People lived in shared rooms. They worked in open fields. They ate at common tables. Privacy was a luxury reserved for the ultra-rich. But as the lock and key became smaller, cheaper, and hidden from view, that luxury was democratized. The key became the tool that built the modern wall. It allowed a person to lock the world out. It allowed them to lock themselves in. It created the private room, the private drawer, and the private diary. We stopped being defined by what we shared with the tribe. We started being defined by what we kept hidden from it. The individual was born the very moment the key vanished into the pocket. Now we are witnessing the final act of this vanishing play. The key is no longer shrinking, it is dissolving. We are entering the era of the invisible key. A phone unlocks a door as a person approaches, triggered by a silent pulse of radio waves. A car breathes to life because a transponder in a pocket sent a ghost signal to its engine. The face, the fingerprint, and the pattern of the retina are becoming the keys to our digital lives. We have moved from the 5-pound iron bar to a sequence of zeros and ones floating in the air. Feels like the ultimate freedom. No more jangling pockets. No more lost brass. No more heavy metal. But there is a quiet, unsettling irony in this convenience. When the key was a massive piece of iron, it was honest. You knew exactly who had the power because you could see the metal. When the key was in your pocket, you still felt the weight of your own privacy. You could reach down and touch it. You could feel its edges. You could reassure yourself that your secrets were still safe. But when the key becomes invisible, when it becomes a part of your body or a line of code owned by a distant corporation, who really holds the power? History suggests a strange, inverse law. As the object gets smaller, the secret gets bigger. In the dust of Egypt, everyone knew what was behind the door. In the halls of the Middle Ages, the chamberlain knew. In the modern era, only you knew. But today, as the physical key disappears entirely, we are left to wonder if our privacy is disappearing with it. We have traded the heavy, visible burden of the iron key for the light, invisible ease of the digital one. We feel more secure than ever. Yet, we might look back at those Romans who wore their keys on their fingers with a touch of envy. They understood something we are desperate to forget. They knew that if you cannot see the key, you can never truly be sure who is actually holding the lock. We used to carry our secrets on our shoulders for all the world to see. Now we carry them in a cloud we cannot touch. We protect them with keys we cannot feel. We guard them with codes we do not own. We are left wondering why, despite all our technology, we feel more exposed than the man with the 5-pound piece of iron. The key is gone. The door is still there. And somewhere, in the silence of the digital dark, someone is always listening for the click.